Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show again. Every week, I try to get out two shows, and I talk to some really good experts on what they know. And a lot of this is not conspiracy; it's coming from my guests, and that's their background, their history, their investigations. This is the Dave Emmons Show, and I'm glad that you're coming on and here listening to us. We've been getting quite a few viewers, and I appreciate that. I've been following that, and I appreciate your comments. If you have comments, just let us have those. I make sure the guest gets those, and the guest also sees them. So if you have those, just write those in too. Today, my guest, in which I'll be running this show. This is December 16th. I'll be running this show in a couple of days. I got back-to-back shows, so I try to space them out to give the guest plenty of opportunity to, for people to hear their show. I don't like to crowd the shows together because a lot of times that will cause people to say, okay, I got to watch this show and then this show, and they might miss them. So I try to space them out, and I don't try to get one in every day, but one every 3 or 4 days, so you get a chance to really read these shows out or listen to them out. Today, I have David White. I've had him before. Very impressive writer. I've actually read some of his products, and I've written 3 books. I got my third book ready to go out. But this guy is a real writer. He writes. I mean, I guess you can talk about English playwrights and things like that, but he's written some books that really have some colorful language, very much into the, I guess you would call it uh, literature that's sophisticated literature, I could call it. But he's a freelance writer, and he's freelance writer, and he writes about everything. I mean, not just literature or award-winning books. He's an award-winning writer with 20 years of experience creating content for Chicago area advertisers and publishers, with multiple completed screenplays and novels. He's an experiencer in UFOs, and that's why he knows a little bit about the UFO topic and what's going on with disclosure. He had an encounter with the Men in Black, and this was back. They had a 1960 Cadillac. We got into that story. He's into disembodied voices, numerous near-death experiences. He's moderately a psychic, and also he's been with he calls himself the Knights Templar scribe, and he knows a little bit about Knights Templars and the history. And this guy is full of history, and he also dispels a lot of conspiracy theories, in which we're going to talk about probably straight up because it's in the news today. He's into astronomy. He studies constantly. I know that he's into quantum physics, and you can look him up, and we're going to tell you how to look him up on the web and find out all of his books and his writings and screenplays and articles that he's written. A fabulous writer, and that's why I always like having him back. But he's also a great investigator, and sometimes I talk to him and I get corrected on certain things, and I try to redirect my investigations from this guy. He's very good. That's why I have him back. David White, anything to add, buddy?
Don't say my writing is sophisticated. It'll turn 90% of the people off. I write
No, you
science
write everything.
fiction, adventure stories, but I try to base my writing on solid research.
Right.
A lot of science fiction stories don't do that, so I try to go with what I learned when I was a kid reading Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Arthur C. Clarke, the great writers of science fiction who studied science and based their stories off of things like that. Arthur C. Clarke was the first one that wrote about orbiting satellites being used to bounce television and phone conversations.
Right.
So some of those guys were able to predict the future through their writing based.
Yeah.
Did we hang up already?
Yeah, we had a Zoom glitch, just like I told you. It usually starts
Okay.
off. I don't know why. I got most of it fixed through my cable company and through Zoom, in which you can't talk to anybody. You just have to chat, and you can't get anything done there. But yes, that's a glitch. So continue. Remember where you left off, David White?
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Continue on.
Okay.
All right.
Um, we're at a point in time where humanity is making tremendous progress in so many fields. Like you mentioned before, astronomy with the James Webb Telescope. We're making huge progress in identifying overlooked segments of our past with sites like Göbekli Tepe, which added 6,000 years onto what we thought was the history of humans working together in established settlements. 30 years ago, any archaeologist would have told you the earliest civilization was in either Sumeria or China or India, take your pick, around 4000 BC, or Egypt, don't want to leave them out. But when we uncovered Göbekli Tepe and a number of other sites like Göbekli Tepe all through the Anatolia, southern, southeastern Turkish region, we discovered that these sites are at least 10,000 BC, if not older. There might be, they're thinking now, a couple of sites that go back to 11,000 BC.
Yeah.
And we are having to rethink everything we thought we knew about archaeology. There are now sites in South America, for example, where we realize from Sacsayhuaman, which is just outside of Cusco, to Machu Picchu, that there were pre-Inca civilizations that used stone cutting techniques that we would have a hard time duplicating right now. There's a very robust argument going on across Twitterverse on whether this is hand cut technology using something like a plasma cutter, some kind of lasers, whether they used mirrors to reflect solar energy to cut stones, or whether it's geopolymer and concrete. And it's a very lively discussion where we don't really have a lot of evidence except the stones themselves.
Right.
A lot of traditional archaeologists don't want to address this because then that to them makes it seem like we are denigrating the indigenous population like the Inca. But the Inca told the Spanish themselves when the Spanish conquistadors arrived and they bothered to write stuff down rather than burn all the codices. The Inca explained, we found these sites. We didn't build them. These were built by the gods. You can see sites like Pumapunku, which is on the border between Bolivia and Peru, that there were cuts made in stone that could not have been made with any tools available to the indigenous people. Whether that's aliens or not aliens, whether that's a humanoid race that we've never found the remnants of, whether they disappeared underground or into the hollow earth, if people believe that, or off into the stars, we can't address those questions. But we have to accept that there is evidence of a worldwide culture that was able to cut and stack stones far beyond the capabilities of anyone up to 4000 BC, including the Egyptians and the Romans and everybody like that.
There's a lot of scientists, David, you see on TV. You can't believe everything that you see on TV, but watching this on TV on some of these shows, they tell you that some of these civilizations have just completely disappeared and they cannot find them anywhere. Like in Amazon, they just had a show on the other day about this one particular tribe that was very intelligent. They looked different than we did. They were giants actually in a way, and they just disappeared. Well, I want to get that one thing about the writing drama and stuff. You can write novels, but you also write these scientific journals and books, and so you're a writer across all fields. Let's, I'm not trying to pigeonhole you into being a novelist, but you are a great
Gotcha.
novelist. I read some of that, but also people have to understand that he's got a lot of information that he's written about on his books, and just about these topics here, megalithic architecture and things of that nature, and which we're getting in. Go ahead, David. I just want to make a clarification there for you.
Not a problem. So I don't necessarily consider myself a scientist. I consider myself a researcher.
Right.
There are really eminent scientists and archaeologists that I try to follow, and I try to listen to what they explain. The difficulty we're having in the world right now is we've got a lot of pushback against science and archaeology, just as one example. There are a lot of people who say, I don't believe anything that NASA tells me. Well, you can't not believe anything, because then you'll have people trying to pretend that the earth isn't round, that it's flat.
Right. Yeah.
And heck, the Greeks figured this out back in like 500 BC. All they needed was two sticks a long distance apart, and they could figure out from the difference of the shadow that they were sitting on a globe. And they actually measured within a certain percentage, like within 5%, the actual diameter of the Earth 2,500 years ago, just from two sticks in the shadows. So you can't deny all science. Um, and I've seen both sides of the archaeological debate going on right now, where the group that wants to believe in the megalithic construction being attributed to worldwide civilization that we can't find much evidence of don't want to listen to any of the archaeologists. And on the other side, the archaeologists don't want to accept any of these new concepts. The only thing you can say in that point is many times we've had scientists um, who were pushed aside, who were shunted aside because their beliefs, their theories were so far beyond what traditional archaeology at that time or traditional geography or geology
Right.
um, they were so different that it was hard for them to accept these new ideas because it meant that they would have to basically shatter everything they knew. One of the quotes that I taught my kids that I hold true to this day is by a guy named Alvin Toffler, who considers himself a futurist. He looks at what's going on now, he predicts what's happening in the future, what will happen. And he had a really interesting quote. He said, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who can't read and write, but those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that's where we're at these days. We have to
That's
unlearn some of the things we thought we knew,
that's
and we
right
have to
on.
relearn new
Yeah,
ideas.
that's right on, David. That's pretty neat slogan. Wow. I
Yeah.
mean, the people need to be enlightened what's going on. We've been
Right.
fooled by history for so long. And
Right.
you mentioned that a lot of these buildings and this megalithic architecture is so precise that how could the people living during those times do that? So we have to go to the part where there were ancient civilizations here. Either they were here or born here, been here, and they're not extraterrestrial, and they just became very intelligent. Or you have to go on the other broad range of it that it was extraterrestrial that come here and did this. You alluded to that a while ago. What's your
We,
thoughts?
we, and I've had this argument with David Hatcher Childress, who's famous on the History Channel with Ancient Aliens. And I've tried to get him to admit that we have to get beyond how these were built, and we have to accept that these were not built by the cultures that they're being attributed to. That the Egyptians did not build, for example, the Osirion, which is an underground complex south of Giza, quite a ways. It was built at the level where the platforms underground were at the water line of the Nile River, some 8 or 9 miles to the east. There was a stairway that would go down into basically a trough around this subterranean platform. And it looks like you were supposed to walk into the water and up the other side. And then there's this platform. The walls around this have the same megalithic architecture that you see in Cusco, at Sacsayhuaman, at Machu Picchu, and also at Easter Island, which is odd because people don't think of Easter Island as having megalithic architecture.
Right.
There is a wall there that is just perfectly constructed of blocks just like the ones at Sacsayhuaman. We've since been able to figure out that Easter Island and Giza sit on a world line that goes around the world that includes sites like Angkor Wat, but it also includes Cusco. And the odd thing is, Easter Island is about 2,000 miles off the coast of Chile, I believe. And you couldn't draw a line around the Earth without starting at Easter Island because it has to be a precise point. And if Giza has to be where it is, some people claim it was sort of the geographic center of Europe, Asia, and Africa. If you're going to have Giza and Easter Island as the starting points for this world line, and Angkor Wat on the other side of the planet, then how would you fit Cusco in there? Well, there's this really interesting legend that there were these children called the Children of the Sun who arose out of Lake Titicaca in South America that traveled north with two magic items. One of the magic items they had was something called the axe of gold, also called the axe of the gods. And it was called the axe of gold because it had a gold beam that cut stone like butter. That's the way we would describe it. The Inca didn't have butter because they didn't have cows, they didn't have milk, but that's the way we would describe it. And supposedly, what these two people did, they're sort of like husband, wife, brother, sister,
Right.
um, which is not uncommon in Egyptian pantheology, where the husband had to marry the ruling woman in the pantheon or in the family line to basically retain the power to rule the kingdom.
You know,
It was
Like Osiris and Isis were married. Yeah, and they were actually kin. But yeah, they keep it in the royal blood. And
right,
even today, we still have royal blood that kind of rules things, right?
right. So the second item that these two pair had was a golden rod, was a staff. And they were told that when the staff sank into the ground without resistance, that's where you'd found your holy city. So they traveled north from Lake Titicaca, which is not far from Pumapunku. And um, as they went north, they kept putting this rod into the ground, and it sank in this area where Cusco is now located. And according to the legend, that's how they founded their holy city. Well, if you've already got a line stretched around the globe that includes Easter Island to the west, Giza to the east, all you have to do is wait until you're about in the middle of those. And if you had something like GPS, you would be able to figure out where to put your city. And that's how they founded Cusco. Now that if that were something that had been written about 500 years ago, the mid 1500s, nobody would understand what that meant. But now that we have things like GPS and satellite surveying, we can see that that's exactly how you would set up a city like Cusco to be on a line between Easter Island and Giza. And all three of those sites have the same kind of megalithic architecture.
Do you think
So
academia is starting to accept some of this, David? Are they slowly
Not
accepting?
exactly. No, no, they're pushing back even harder. A perfect example is the current Netflix show that Graham Hancock is doing, where he's getting hammered in the press, and part of it is because of this desire not to make it look like the the white people designed everything, and
Right.
it's denying the ability of indigenous peoples to build things. I think the people who are looking at megalithic architecture are trying not to say that, but they are saying that if you look at all the evidence of the tools that were available to the dynastic Egyptians, for example, or the Romans, or the Inca, you can see that they were not able to do the kinds of things that this megalithic architecture shows signs of having been done. In Cusco, for example, there's a, a weird little round stone that has a cat or a puma carved into the top of it. They keep this in a back room. There's very few videos of this, but there's enough that if you look for it online, you can find it. And there is unmistakable evidence that somebody melted the stone in order to carve this figurine.
Hmm.
It's undeniable. And it looks like it was done with something as small as a pencil or a toothpick. You can see where the stone has melted down. And this is not, limestone where you can melt it at, 800 or 1,000 degrees. Some of these stones that have been melted in this way are granite and andesite, which take thousands of degrees to be able to melt. One of the stones at Sacsayhuaman has a very famous, they call it a snake. It's a couple of feet long, and it's got circles where somebody melted the stone, and you can see that it dripped down around the outside. This is not the Inca.
Yeah,
This just was not them.
I saw pictures of stone steps, and a couple of them were melted. And what was
That's in Egypt. That's at one of the temples. It's not clear that those were melted through heat. I will say that because, frankly, if it was melted by heat, the walls would have melted too.
Yeah.
So it's not. It's been suggested that that was done through a solar flare, except the doorway is pristine, so there's no way that that could have melted through a solar flare and run down the steps and yet not have been affected in the rest of that area.
So
That's one of the problems.
conspiracy theories are okay for academia, right?
Well, okay, so to define a conspiracy, All that means is two or more people working so closely together that they're breathing each other's air. That's where the Latin word conspire comes from. It basically means to breathe each other's air as you're talking. So it means people huddle together. You know, anytime you get two or three people talking together, technically that's a conspiracy. What we interpret it for in the modern age, especially since the Kennedy assassination, is a group of people trying to put together a common theory that explains something dark and mysterious that's going on that we aren't supposed to know about. That's how we see conspiracies these days. You know, if you have a boardroom that determines they're going to put their oil on sale for the same price that four other competitors are, I mean, technically that's a conspiracy.
Right.
You know, if you've got a company that says we're going to make sure that nobody knows that our 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 own scientists are telling us that we're causing global warming by burning fossil fuels, like Exxon did, that's a conspiracy.
Yeah.
But it's not seen the same way either by the public or by the media.
Yeah, these conspiracies go all the way back through all of our ancient times, thousands of years ago, where the elites and the high priest kept all the secrets away from the peons or the people on the street, the average guy. Now, getting involved in conspiracy theories, we're not going to like talk conspiracy theories about this JFK thing because right now it's been 59 years, and you just said that they did have an information dump yesterday on some of these papers. Could you tell us what you learned from that or what you think about that, the John F. Kennedy file?
We haven't learned much, unfortunately. There were 13,000 pages roughly released. There are people poring over it right now. The four or five sources that I've looked at who have studied them so far say that the only thing of any real interest is that we know now that Lee Harvey Oswald, or whoever was claiming to be Lee Harvey Oswald, who went to Mexico City,
Right.
was trying to call the Russian embassy and asking them if there was any progress being made on his attempts to go back to Russia, because he wanted to go back. He didn't want to stay in the United States. And the reason that this was kept secret was because apparently the it seems like the Russian embassy may have been bugged with the knowledge and approval of the Mexican president. So they were keeping that quiet for the longest time because they didn't want it to be known that the Mexican president was working for basically the CIA and the United States government.
Yeah, the Cold War was pretty heated during that time. Yeah.
Well, well, I don't know the particulars of what went on in the room when they were conducting the Warren report, which some people would claim that that was a conspiracy theory in itself. But it seems very likely that the Warren report was designed to create this myth of the lone gunman so that the American people wouldn't blame Russia or Cuba for the assassination and would not ask us to go militarily to war against either of those countries.
Yeah,
Um,
let me remind the social media platforms what David White is talking about. These aren't conspiracies. These are printed articles and information that has been put out by other news information organizations, and we're recapping, or David's recapping these things. It's not from his conspiracy thoughts or anything, or this show's conspiracy thoughts. It's actually what has been put out there for the public. Right, David?
right, right. These are actually being held in the National Archives. They have been withheld due to various agencies, primarily the CIA, claiming that they don't want to reveal some of their intelligence gathering methods or some of their sources. At least that's the excuse that they're giving. There are two documents that are available in the public view that still cast severe doubt on what the CIA's role in the Kennedy assassination was. There's a third one that this recent trove of released documents from the National Archives talks about, where there was a briefing document that was given to Kennedy by one of his advisors that talked about what the CIA was doing. And apparently, this document is heavily redacted. So even at this date, 59 years later, we don't know what Kennedy was being told about the CIA, that the CIA doesn't want us to hear what our own president heard 60 years ago.
Right.
The reason that that's significant is, and this is something that you can find on the CIA website itself, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the CIA did a lot of things that were beyond their charter. Their charter was supposed to allow them to gather intelligence on our adversaries, not to do intelligence gathering on US citizens or on US soil, and to basically leave the violent part of things to the military. Well, the CIA basically did whatever the heck it wanted to and broke the law on a number of occasions. And these leaks kept coming out throughout the 70s to a point where the CIA director in the 70s, I believe it was Arthur Schlesinger, decided he wanted all this information on his desk. He wanted to not be blindsided by any more revelations that were coming out. So he had the CIA bureau chiefs and the people in the office put together something that they call the family jewels. If you do a Google search for family jewels and CIA, you'll come to a website run by the CIA where they released a document that was put together for the CIA chief. And it was supposed to be only internally held, but in the 80s, this was released. And it hit numbers, one after another of all these horrible things that the CIA did. They note numerous times where they tried to kill Castro, they tried to assassinate.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's
It's
well
in
known.
plain sight. They subverted democratic governments in Chile and Iraq and Iran. They did all these horrible. They once put LSD in the water supply of a French town
Yeah.
just to see what would happen.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell are you doing?
Right.
Where in your charter does it say you can do it? And there were obviously a few other things that they overlooked. They talked about MK Ultra, which was basically a sort of brainwashing organization run out of Montauk on Long Island,
Right.
which has since been horribly denied by the CIA over and over again. And then finally they were like, yeah, we did that.
Yeah, I've had a
But
few guests that MK Ultra people that started off very young, and they talk about this. And I let them talk about it because it's their bio, it's their history. It's not a conspiracy.
but,
We're not.
but let me
You and I aren't going, not going to put our opinions on either one, the JFK story or anything.
sure.
So you're reading from everything that you've investigated and heard. Yes.
So the important thing is this document that's available from the CIA itself has its number one object in its family jewels still fully redacted. There's a briefing document that shows like 3 or 4 pages with a paragraph on each of these subjects. Every single one is outlined with following documented pages of what was going on and explains it in more detail, except family jewel number one, which is not just fully redacted on its paragraph, but the 2 pages that support it in the following documents, those are completely redacted too. Now, the only 2 things that the family jewels does not talk about are UFOs and the Kennedy assassination. And I gotta believe they're not dumb enough to put anything down on paper about UFOs. That was about the CIA being involved in the Kennedy
Well, let's
assassination.
get into that subject right now. UFO disclosure, David. Uh,
Mhm.
that's something that you've studied also, and the Pentagon, disclosure, and the Pentagon released information. Now they're telling us the military and the Pentagon believe these are UFOs and that they're extraterrestrial. Am I right?
Not exactly. Okay, so let's go back through the steps. Okay, so um, a lot of people think that the UFO cover-up started with Roswell in 1947 in July. That's not exactly true. You have to go back to 2 previous events. The first one was a Cape Girardeau event that happened in 1941 in Missouri, where, according to the wife of a reverend who was called out in the middle of the night to perform last rites, supposedly on some pilots who had died in a plane crash nearby, according to her on her deathbed, she said that her husband was called to a UFO crash and that there were dead and dying aliens. Now, it's kind of hard to prove that that did or did not happen, but it's also pretty hard to deny somebody saying something like that on their deathbed, especially the wife of a minister or a reverend. So that's the first event where the military seems to have been involved in something in North America that we can possibly suggest might have been a crashed UFO with possible occupants. Okay,
Right.
that's 1941.
Yes.
Then in December of 41, Pearl Harbor. In February of 42, there's something called the Battle of Los Angeles, the Battle of LA, where there was, because of war nerves, Pearl Harbor had happened just 2 months before, people were jittery on the West Coast. And something or some things appeared on the coast near Los Angeles that were spotted by searchlights. At that time, radar was pretty rudimentary. We didn't really have any radar on the West Coast to speak of, but these searchlights caught something in its converging beams. There's an excellent picture that you can see from, I think, the LA Times that's been reprinted in numerous
Yes.
places.
Yes. A lot of people think.
Supposedly, this thing was fired at for an hour and a half. They fired some 13,000 shells, and at least 3 people died on the ground, 2 apparently from heart attack, 1 from falling shrapnel. And this object was never touched, and apparently it just continued in over the coast. Now, according to the MJ-12, the Majestic 12 documents that were released a decade or 2 ago, whose, we have to admit, whose authenticity is still under question. At that point, the General of the Armies for the United States, George Marshall, created a group called the, I've written about this. What's this called? It's called the,
Paperclip? Not paperclip.
no, Paperclip was after World War II, where we brought Nazis in, and
Right.
they populated, by the way, NASA and the CIA.
Right.
But that's a whole different story.
Yes.
The Interplanetary Phenomena Unit, the IPU. Okay, we have a document. Again, its authenticity is under some dispute, where Marshall supposedly started up this group, the IPU, to investigate where these craft came from. There are other reports from the Battle of Los Angeles that suggest that there were 8 or 9 of these objects that flew in over the coast, but that only one of them was involved in this major shooting event. From that point, from 1942, you can then begin to see different militaries around the world having to contend with what might be non-terrestrial intelligences. That's where we get into the globes that seem to be following certain airplanes, not just in Europe and the big fleets that were fighting over, France and Germany, but also in the Pacific and going towards Japan. These were called Foo Fighters.
Right.
Every Army and Air Force thought it was the other side. Every single one was worried that this was some enemy super weapon. The Germans thought it was ours. We thought it was the Germans until we started seeing them with Japan too, and in Italy. There's been no good explanation of what Foo Fighters were. After the war, when we were doing nuclear weapons testing in the Southwest, there were similar globes like that being spotted around, and our military was completely at a loss. And they were also a little worried because some of these flying green balls appeared to take a very big interest in our nuclear weapons storage and testing areas.
Mm-hmm.
There were something called ghost rockets in Sweden, where these things would just fall out of the sky and supposedly crash on the beach. We're still not sure to this day whether there was actually any wreckage found, but we're pretty sure it was not the Germans because it was after the war. And we're pretty sure it wasn't the Russians because the Russians didn't have launch sites anywhere close enough to do this. Plus, why would they be launching them at Sweden? They'd be basically sharing their technology. If they were going to do launch testing, they'd be doing it, farther into their country, Azerbaijan or Siberia or someplace like that.
Mm-hmm.
So long before Roswell happened, as much as 4 or 5 years before Roswell, we were contending with our military having to try to figure out what was going on. And then Roswell. And Roswell happened after there was this Kenneth Arnold sighting in the Pacific Northwest, where he saw what he described as bat wing shaped craft flying like they were skipping plates along the water. And some reporter called it, flying saucers, and that's where we get the term flying saucer.
Yeah.
except the first ones weren't saucer shaped. They were batwing shaped, which is interesting. There is people who are familiar with UFO research know the name of Jacques Vallée, who's a famous French researcher who worked with Dr. J. Allen Hynek
Right.
back about the time that I was actually going to school and got to meet Dr. Hynek and take some classes with him. Jacques Vallée has pointed out that in Europe, where records of paranormal events go back hundreds of thousands of years, the places where we now see UFOs or aliens used to see pixies and fairies and angels
Angels.
and dwarves and gnomes and those kind of creatures.
Right.
And he postulated that it's possible that whatever this or these intelligences are, they're only showing us what we expect to see, and technology wise, just beyond our grasp. So, for example, in the 50s, when we were beginning to show, rockets on screen, like, uh, uh, some of the science fiction movies that we showed back then had basically rockets with fins. That's what we would see as UFOs. Or we'd see these big tubes with like discs that would come out, like Mentos.
Mm.
Um, then, it progresses into batwing shapes and discs and triangles. Now we're seeing these big flat-sided, massive, Walmart-sized UFOs that I got to tell you, they're not us. We're not building those.
Right. I
We have
saw
a
one of those huge craft. Yeah. Yeah, I can testify to that.
we as a technology have a hard time keeping 747s flying. We've had accidents because they're incredibly complicated. When they first built the F-117, that thing could not fly without computer assistance. And if the computers failed on that thing, it would basically plummet like a rock because it is not aerodynamic. A lot of these planes that we have now that are stealthy don't have the kind of control surfaces that a normal plane would need. And if it weren't for the computer fly by wire, they call it technology, we wouldn't be able to have these things airborne.
Right. Did you
Um,
see that David, the F-35 yesterday or the day before, where it was trying to hover, it stops and hovers, and then it wasn't successful. It started smoking or something, and it started dropping, and then it hit the runway really hard, and it bounced off the runway, and the pilot actually ejected on the ground with the
yeah, yeah.
parachute, and they said the F-35 failed. So yeah, we're still having problems keeping those things aloft.
Well, and that's a perfect example. So the F-35 uses big ducts to pull air up and basically allow it to pull air in when it's not moving. It had a vent on the top of the plane that used to open up sideways, so it was parallel with the airframe. And the problem was when it was sending this air down, it was also pulling that air up, and the air was somehow too hot for the engines to use properly, and it would cause them to fail. So they decided that they would put the doors to open backwards, like behind the canopy, so that it wouldn't take that hot air that its own engines were kicking up into the air. We're still basically not that far removed from the Wright brothers putting bicycle parts onto a glider trying to fly at 50 feet down the coast.
Whatever happened to this idea that they're back engineering ET technology? If they were, wouldn't we have better jets?
Oh, we wouldn't just have better jets, we would have better everything. There's a story I like to tell people that when we got involved in the Balkan War in the 1990s, a lot of people at that time, for whatever reasons, didn't want us to get involved in that war because they thought it was going to be a massive drain on our military and it would cause thousands of deaths. As it turned out, I believe we only had one plane shot down. That was one F-117, and the pilot was recovered. And the only two deaths that I know about were deaths in the just then released Apache helicopters, which were put into service right then because they wanted to see what they could do in combat, but they weren't ready yet. They hadn't gone through all of the pre-combat testing that they really needed to go through. One of them crashed and killed the two pilots, and then it was basically taken offline. The U.S. military has no qualms about throwing new technology into combat any chance they get. One of the reasons we don't hear about some of this technology is because they're testing it just as soon as they can. They just don't want us to know about it.
Right.
If we had something as big as a as a super Walmart, which is what the Stevensville UFO was described as in 2007, I think 2008. Um, if we had something that could make something that big with flat sides fly, we would be dominating the skies over Ukraine right now.
Okay. Since we're in that train of thought right now, David, what do you think about disclosure and the Pentagon information? You think it's just going to dribble out, or are we really going to have disclosure this coming year?
Okay, well, we have to look at the 5 Pentagon UAP videos that were released. Now, technically, they weren't really released by the Pentagon. They were released through civilian sources, and the Pentagon never admitted these were UFOs. All they would admit was these were taken by US military personnel. They would not even go as far as to say they were taken from US military sites or using US military gear or technology. Um, every single one of those 5 UAPs, I believe, to my satisfaction, were proven to be common mundane items. They're infrared flares, they're technology mistakes like the green pyramid one. Those are basically those are artifacts from a cell phone iris, which closes down like this. And you can even see when there's flashing on there that one of those things is an airplane with its FAA lights flashing. And one of them, which supposedly is this craft crashing into the ocean, and somebody's going splash, splash. You can tell by watching the display on the readout that they've cut 6 minutes out of this thing to make it look like it went across the sky faster. So the Pentagon knew when these things were released, these were not UFOs. They kept back and pretended like this might be UFOs, but we're not going to talk about it. Um, and the thing that worries me the most about all this is Commander Fravor, the guy who was part of the Nimitz event in 2004. If what he says he saw is true, none of those 5 videos show that. None of those 5 videos show a tic tac shaped object.
Why?
And he knows.
Why would they make this disinformation up to the public? Why?
Okay, okay, there are 2 possible reasons. There are actually a bunch of different reasons, but the 2 most prominent reasons are, number one, they want to scare China and Russia into thinking that we do have this technology and we're back engineering it, except the Chinese and the Russians are probably not that gullible, which leads to the second one, which is they want the American people to think that there are UFOs in our skies. And hey, we need to spend more money to try to figure out what they are and more money to try to counter them with our own technological innovations. And it's basically just a grab for more money, which has successfully happened because now the US government, in its latest fiscal budget, has put more money into UFO studying quote unquote programs.
Right.
Even though we have a military that overspends the next 9 countries combined, we spend more than Great Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Russia, China, and name a couple of others. Combined, we spend more money than them. Do you know how many aircraft carriers we have right now in service?
I heard we have about 8, 9,
11.
11.
You know how much the latest one, the Ford carrier class, costs? About $12 billion a piece.
Yeah.
$1 billion. That's just the aircraft carrier. That's not the airplanes. That's not the 90 some odd F-35s that are going to be flying on it, or the pilots, or the 3,000 sailors, or the 2 nuclear submarines that have to travel with that battle group, or the Aegis cruiser that travels with the battle group, or the handful of destroyers and other craft and the support craft, and the people at port that have to keep them supplied. We're putting billions and billions of dollars into every single aircraft carrier battle group. And and I'm not really sure if that's the best place for us to spend money.
Also, there's
Just to,
an accounting. There's an accounting thing that holds. They're not holding people accountable for the money that they're getting and spending in Washington D.C. and it's going all over the place, and we don't know where those billions are going. Let's go back to President Eisenhower on his exit speech. He said the one big fear that the U.S. people have is the military-industrial complex. and that's the ones that are getting the money. They're getting all this money for these projects. And also, secondly, let me follow up, and you can tell me. He was supposed to have meetings with the ETs, Eisenhower, twice, maybe even three times, and his granddaughter is going around talking about this. Laura Eisenhower,
Mhm.
she's going around talking about it. What do you feel about both of those topics, Eisenhower and the
Well, Eisenhower, if you do any research on World War II, you'll find out he was not a battlefield commander the way Patton or Bernard Montgomery for the British were. He was an organizer. He was an implementer. He was basically a military bureaucrat of the highest order. I mean that in the in the most complimentary way I can. His organization of the Allied forces in Europe was basically brilliant. He knew who needed what, where, when, and organized it to a point where if it weren't for the bickering between Montgomery and Patton, we probably could have ended the war 6 months earlier. He was smart, and by the way, people don't remember this. He was a Republican only because at the time that he was running for president, he was an independent, and he thought it might be better to balance out the fact that the country had had 4 terms of a Democratic president followed by Truman, and he figured maybe it was time for a Republican president. That's the only reason why he ran as a Republican. He was probably as much a Democratic president as he was a Republican, or more so. But he was
yeah, what
smart
about,
enough to know.
he was a
Sorry,
big
go ahead.
picture, but he was a big picture guy. You're saying the big
Yeah,
picture. Yeah.
yeah.
Also,
And he was smart enough to know that there were elements in the military that he didn't want to try to fight. So he waited until his last public speech to mention the military industrial complex.
right,
He was the first person that I'm aware of that used that in a public speech to the American people. And I believe his actual thoughts or his actual words were, once you get the military industrial complex on your back, you won't get them off.
right.
And I believe he's correct. This is what, 4 years before Kennedy was assassinated,
What about the agreement he made with the ETs, supposedly?
supposedly.
Yeah,
Well, okay, so this is based around an actual event where Eisenhower was in the West, in California. He supposedly disappeared for part of the night. And before the reporters could actually figure out what had happened, somebody wrote a report that said he had died. And that actually made the news rounds before it got pulled. And they said, no, 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 no. He went off to have some dental work done in the middle of the night. There's not clear evidence to me that his dentist was even in the state. And there's never been clear evidence that I'm aware of that they ever had a dentist identified as having been cleared to work on the president, nor was there ever any proof that he actually had any dental work done. So there is this possibility that he did disappear in the middle of the night in California for reasons unexplained. Um, Gordon Cooper, the astronaut, worked at, if I remember correctly, Edwards Air Force Base where this supposedly took
right.
place.
Mm-hmm.
Before this happened, there was an incident where they were using theodolite cameras, which are basically cameras on telescopes, so that you can watch rockets far up in the atmosphere. And supposedly they picked up a UFO, and the UFO came down towards Edwards Air Force Base and sort of landed at the end of the runway, did a few things, and then took off. This is what's partly shown in the movie Close Encounters of the Third Kind, although greatly Hollywoodized. But it's basically a UFO lands at an Air Force base and does a few maneuvers and takes off. It's possible, I think the more likely possibility is that they still had video footage of or film footage of this, which they showed to Eisenhower in the middle of the night at that base because it was under strict lock and key. And they weren't going to make a copy of it and send it halfway across the planet to get it to Washington for him to watch. They waited until he got there and they showed him this footage. Now, was he actually in contact with aliens? A lot of people want to believe so. I sort of think if they had contacted him, he would have shared that with the American people. If he was willing to talk about the military industrial complex, which he knew was at risk of his life just to even mention, you got to think he would have been willing to risk his life to tell us that there's other civilizations wanting to
Yeah,
talk to us.
wouldn't that been a greater threat because they've been trying to keep the UFO topic down since 1941, like you said, and
Oh yeah,
47. Yeah, they were
oh yeah.
wanting to keep that hush hush. So I think actually the president, I think Eisenhower would probably do that because, yeah, I think that he'd be afraid for his life. While we're talking about that, there's
Well,
an
no, no, okay.
interesting. Go
Let me
ahead. Go
back
ahead.
you, let me back you up just a little. He was a brave man. I don't think he'd be worried about his life. I think he would see that as the duty to the public to let them know the truth. He didn't go so far as to say that during his military industrial complex speech, because I think it didn't go that far. I think he knew that we had videos or film of non-human intelligence craft, non-terrestrial craft. But at that point, we didn't know what it was, so it wasn't clear that it would help to talk about those things. But I don't think he didn't do it because he was afraid of his life. I think he was a brave man and he would have willingly sacrificed his life if he thought it was for the greater good. I just think at that point, we as a country didn't know what it was. It was still possible, although by the late 50s, we were pretty sure we had ruled it out. It was still possible that this might have been Russians using captured German scientists and their technology to build whatever it was that were flying in our skies. We were still a little worried about
Right.
it.
Let's.
And
Yeah.
just to point out, one of the reasons why groups like the CIA, starting from 47, wanted to put a kibosh on UFOs and make it look like it was all swamp gas and Venus was because they could see that during a UFO flap, our still then primitive uh, phone networks were being overwhelmed by people calling in about UFOs. And they knew that if the Russians were ever going to attack us, they could overload our communication systems by first pretending that there's a major UFO flap. So the CIA decided that they were going to put the burners down on UFOs because they wanted the people in the American public not to give it much credence so that we would be less at risk of having our communications network overloaded in case of an actual war with Russia.
And
Somebody
moving on with the show, David. We have a note here, but
are we stuck in
there's
one
so
spot
much,
too much?
you got to talk about that. I want to keep moving on to these other topics. Like Travis
Gotcha.
Walton, it's a hoax. I mean, did they really find that out that he's Travis Walton is a hoax?
According to his brother-in-law actually had some very interesting details. There, there was a prize being offered by the Inquirer. I think it was $10,000 to have actual proof of UFOs or abductions. So Travis Walton and his brother-in-law concocted this plan where they were going to use an abandoned watchtower up in the hills, where Travis Walton's brother was going to drive this pickup truck up to it, and they had another person turn on a spotlight on the watchtower, and Travis Walton would fling himself forward, and then his brother would drive the pickup truck away, and then Travis would then hide out in the tower for 3 or 4 days. And when his brother came back with the rest of the crew, he took him back to a different spot so that he didn't take him back to where the tower was. So when they started doing a search for him, they searched an entirely different area, which wasn't the area where the tower was. That way, everybody else in the crew could pass a lie detector test, which they did. But Travis and his brother-in-law may not have done as good on the lie detector test as the government wanted them to. They actually handpicked, I believe, their own uh, lie detector person.
Right.
There's been some problems with that. They were awarded the prize from the Inquirer. There's a famous picture of them all holding up a check. And since then, his brother-in-law has become very disenchanted with Travis. There has been some fight on Facebook about the fact that Travis was bad to his wife, his brother-in-law's sister, and was living in her house. And basically, it was filled with trash, and there are a lot of other personal problems. And at some point, his brother-in-law just said, "I've had it. I'm telling the truth." Um, but then this gets back to the X-Files. And the reason I bring up the X-Files is because one of the most famous things that we still remember for those of us who watched that show was the poster that Mulder had in his office with a UFO that said on the bottom of it, "I want to believe."
Right. I
Okay,
saw that.
that's still the state of ufology in most of the world. We want to believe. The problem is we are too easy to believe hoaxes and liars and charlatans and grifters. What it should have said was, I want the truth. That's what we should be aiming for, the truth. We should be willing to point out hoaxers and not get mad at people when a hoax is revealed as being a denier or somebody who can't handle the truth, because frankly there's a lot of money to be made in lying about abductions and UFOs. One of the big things that's going on right now is, if you're familiar with David Wilcock, who was on Gaia TV a few years ago, he had these two guys with him, Corey Smith and no, Corey Good and somebody Smith. And Corey Good had claimed that he had, sorry, Emery Smith, that's it. Corey Good had claimed that he had gone to Mars multiple times as part of this top secret program, spent 20 years there, and then he'd be brought back in time so that no time had elapsed here. Perfectly designed so that he doesn't have to provide any evidence of where he's gone, nor explain the fact that he could have spent a total of 60 years on Mars and not aged a day. And a lot of people didn't believe him, but a lot of people did, including David Wilcock. Um, so, so Corey Good now has come out and claimed copyright protection for all of the stories he's put out, including the fact that we had Jupiter-sized UFOs flying through our
Yeah, I've
planetary
heard
system.
those stories. Yeah.
And those were populated by blue avians. He's copyrighted blue avians, as it turned
What
out.
about NASA? Did they also didn't they admit that they've seen things out there?
No, not exactly. What Corey Good based his ideas off of was, we have a solar observatory. It's basically a satellite that stares at the sun. And it's got a little disc in the middle that blocks the actual sun itself. So all we see are the corona mass ejections, the CMEs.
Right.
And in a couple of them, because of the way that the information is downloaded to our receivers, it basically does a scan line all the way across, like the old TVs used. Except if you have a little interruption, there'll be a little dot. Okay. And sometimes you'll have two dots, they just happen. So they would take a dot and they would go, haha, if that was the size of an actual object near the sun, it's the size of Jupiter. It's like,
Right.
no, it's a transmission error.
I know
That's all it is. It's
yeah,
a transmission error.
yeah, you're
But they
talking
but
about
they took that and they ran with that.
right.
And scientists and astronomers would say, look, if we had a Jupiter-sized object flying through our solar system, every single object would be perturbed. The Earth would be unbalanced, the moon, it would be trailing a host of comets and meteorites.
Yeah.
Every single scientist
Now
on the ground who had a telescope would have
we're
seen
running
this.
low on time, David, and it gets
Okay.
so interesting. And it goes eats up our time. But I know there's a lot of skeptics out there. I know I've had some experiences, and I wrote a book, and I can tell you, everything that's happened to me, I'm telling the truth. I'm too old to lie, and I know the talking heads only prefer stories that have drama in them, something they can make some money off of them, and I know that for a fact. Okay, let's
Right.
tell people where they can find out some more information about you, because we're about ready to close up.
Okay, they can go to my Twitter website. I'm still on Twitter. I don't know how much longer. My Twitter handle is Templar Scribe, TEMPLARSCRIBE. From there, there's links on my profile page to my screenplays and my short stories. They can send me DMs if they want to hear other things, if they want my comments on things. I'm always glad to put,
Okay.
as far as I can, an intelligent, unobjective eye on
We'll
something.
have to have you back, because we got so much to talk about. You're so interesting. You know a lot about all these topics. I love it. Okay, I love having you on the show. We
Thanks,
had
Dave.
David White here, and this is the Dave Emmons Show. We're going to sign off, and you might see David back soon. Thank you ever so much, David, and thanks for
Thank
the
you, Dave.
audience listening.
Pleasure to be here.
Bye bye.
Thank you.